Good day and welcome back to the shed. Today we go back to the red planet to see just how those colonists are faring in Kim Stanley Robinson's Hugo award-winning sequel, Green Mars. So what I would like to do, as always, is provide a spoiler-free plot overview. I'll talk to what I liked, what I didn't like. I'll make some recommendations. We'll put this one to the memory test, and I'll rank it on our ever-growing sci-fi shed ladder, where I've been ranking all the Hugo and Nebula award-winning novels. So the novel takes place after the bloodied and failed revolution of 2061, and we follow the original 100, at least what's left of them, now living in hiding all throughout different parts of Mars. And in particular, we're introduced to their children and grandchildren, referred to as the Nissan and Sen, something like that anyway, but to the first and second generations of true Martian-born individuals. In particular, we learn of this guy called Nergal. He's one of Hiroko's children, and he has a rather interesting anatomy as well. And we also learn that life is still being dictated on Mars by these large transnational companies, these big mega corporations that have got enough power to be able to buy countries as well as governments, and they're sort of making a mess of Earth and still trying to dictate exactly what happens on Mars. All the whilst we have these new generations of Martians who don't want to be held on the strings held by these transnationals and trying to find their own voice in their own independent Mars. We're also introduced to Art Randolph. Now he's one of the employees of these multinationals in a company called Praxis. But Praxis is led by this individual who believes in freedom, and he's been seen as a bit of an oddball when it comes to these multinational organizations, these transnationals. So they send Art onto the planet to infiltrate these underground movements, almost as an ambassador and a spy in many ways, to try and understand if we can bring together all these disparate parties that are happening on Mars into a unified voice. So there's a lot of friction in the underground movement in Mars leading up to a civil war. We also have this huge natural disaster back on Earth that's really pushing and almost making life completely unbearable on Earth. And we have all these second and third generation Martians now wanting the unique voice made on the planet Mars, all combining to bring a pretty interesting end to this wonderful novel. So what is there to like in Green Mars by Kim Stanley Robinson? I mentioned that when I reviewed Red Mars, that for me, this is the pinnacle of terraforming trilogies, right? In Red Mars, Green Mars, and Blue Mars. It really is written in that, future history that is very believable. It's almost like Kim Stanley Robinson was an eyewitness to these events and he's just recording them here for prosperity's sake. And I really did enjoy that. At times, the novel pacing is really wonderful and there's so much that is covered, but it also has a bit of a problem with some of the pacing, and I may come back to that when I talk to about some of the things that I disliked. But when it comes to the terraforming elements in this novel, I thought they were very well done. I really liked the hard science fiction that was taken to address this. There's a whole lot of time spent on looking at rocks and looking at plants and how these plants evolve and how different plants have a little niche in the ecosystem there to help enable terraforming this planet. So I really did enjoy that. I really did like the experiment in terraforming this planet, told in a way that almost was history, and this has been done and this has been recorded for our prosperity. Also really enjoyed the premise, right? Colonizing a planet. How wonderful would it be if we could see it in our generation that we could start to colonize a planet like Red Mars and turn it into something like Green Mars and ultimately into something like Blue Mars. So I really like the premise. I think that is one of my favorite subjects in science fiction. The ability for us to be able to transform these planets into a way that benefits humankind. I thought that's a wonderful premise, and I really enjoyed the way that Kim Stanley Robinson carried on that in this particular novel, Green Mars. The other thing that I enjoyed that I'd sort of forgotten over the years is, the human condition. Like these 100 now are making use of this treatment that allows them to live almost indefinitely. We actually don't even know how long these people can live for because of this treatment that they get. Now, what's rather interesting is I like the fact that, we start exploring the human condition when it comes to our memory recollection. How much memory can we actually store? And it becomes interesting to see some of these 100 and the challenges they start facing with immortality thrown into the picture. So also I really enjoyed that theme in the novel as well. So what is there not to like in Kim Stanley Robinson's Green Mars? Look, for me, I'd have to say that sometimes as I was reading through this, I thought how wonderful of a writer is Kim Stanley Robinson, because the story just flows, and it just flows so wonderfully, and you just get engrossed in it, and you're reading chapters, sometimes hundreds of pages at a time, and it just seems like it flows. But on the other hand, somewhere towards the middle of this novel, I started to see some of the things that really irk me with Kim Stanley Robinson's writing. He has those peaks and troughs. I mean, it's very evident in Green Mars, where sometimes it just gets bloated and it just seems to drag on forever. And unfortunately, this one seemed to be suffering from that a little bit more than what Red Mars did. But I'd have to say that as my key criticism. The writing is great, and sometimes it really captures you and you really flow along with it, and sometimes it feels like it's just grinding to a halt. So I'd have to say that the pacing in this one just didn't really do it for me. The other thing I've got to say in this is that Green Mars really lacks for me what made Red Mars a classic novel, and that is the conflict of interest between the two different characters in Boone and Frank Chalmers, right? It just didn't really have that, and I thought it was a big letdown. It was something like, I was getting to halfway, 3/4 of the way through the novel, was thinking, so what is the plot here? I get the terraforming exercise, but where is the conflict, and where is the conflict resolution going to happen? That was very evident in Red Mars between Boone and Chalmers, and I thought it was one of the absolute highlights. Excellent characters. But I found that in this novel, the really conflict was between these faceless multinationals and these underground revolutionists, and the conflict wasn't really well done. It just lacked that personal conflict that made Red Mars just a classic novel for me. The novel also gets into some pretty deep science when it comes to the rocks and the different plant lives. And look, I'd say that 50 to 60% of what was actually discussed in those sections when we're talking about plant life and the geology of the landscape, I thought was fine, was interesting, but I found it to be a bit too bloated at times. And if I'm going to be overcritical, I don't think the science actually quite stands up. I think there's a lot of scientific explanation, but I don't think that science is actually quite accurate as well, which sort of detracted me a bit. It sort of made it a little bit hard going at times. So look, when it comes to the memory test, this one is an unforgettable trilogy. But I'd have to say that Green Mars, when I'm looking at my full weighted criteria, when it comes to the memory test, it doesn't quite hold up to what Red Mars did. That conflict between Boone and Chalmers and those characters, the first 100 and the trip out to Mars, it was just an unforgettable novel. For those of you who have seen my previous review on Red Mars, I made a comment along the lines that I could almost remember word for word what was going on in that novel. And I'd have to say that is definitely not the case with Green Mars. It is not a very memorable novel when it comes to the plot, nor is it when it comes to the characters as well. It's a middle novel, I'm going to have to say that, and I think it suffers from that middle novel syndrome. It just, a lot of additional detail that I don't think really propels the plot along, and that lack of conflict really does not make it for a very memorable novel when it comes to its own right. As a trilogy, like I said, it's an unforgettable novel. You won't forget Green Mars in the scheme of things, but as a standalone novel, there wasn't much in here. And I must have read this one the last time I read it 18 or so years ago, and it just, honestly, there wasn't much I could really recall from this one. So when it comes to recommendations, I still highly recommend the Mars trilogy, and Green Mars is no exception. I think the three novels are wonderful, but I do have to stress that you may need a bit of patience to get through all of these. So when it comes to similar novels that we've read and covered on the Sci-Fi Shed Ladder, I'd have to say that you definitely don't want to start with Green Mars if you haven't read Kim Stanley Robinson's inaugural Mars book in Red Mars. This really is a must, and I would have to say if you want to try Kim Stanley Robinson, you have to start with Red Mars. And I'd have to say you could probably stop at Red Mars, but it is definitely worthwhile for those of you who have the patience to get through a trilogy of books that thick, right? So I'd have to say definitely have a go. But I think if you've enjoyed Red Mars, you would find there's still plenty in Green Mars to keep you captivated and in love with this wonderful trilogy. Now, if you find that size novel, it's just way too much for you to commit to, I'd have to say, have a go at The Sands of Mars by Arthur C. Clarke, one of the giants in the science fiction genre, because this novel also takes a look at terraforming exercises and or more or less the first colony on Mars, right? And it's got a rather interesting twist in it as well that I found to be a wonderful novel. And I would have to say, if you find the whole terraforming concept really interesting, but those big thick books sort of scare you off, I'd say have a go at Arthur C. Clarke's The Sand of Mars. I think you'll enjoy that. And if you've enjoyed this, then go on to read something like Green Mars or Red Mars. Probably more to the point, though, would be Heinlein's Farmer in the Sky, because this is a terraforming novel in many ways as well, but it's about one of Jupiter's moon in Ganymede. So I thought, Arthur C. Clarke, I thought Heinlein did a wonderful job in this one as well. Really wonderful story. This one probably doesn't get talked about enough. It's one of Robert Heinlein's young adult novels, juvenile fiction, but it's an absolutely wonderful introduction to the terraforming thought experiment, the terraforming exercise. And I'd have to say, if you've enjoyed this, please go on to Red Mars. You'll absolutely love it. So there you have it. We've got to make a ranking on the Sci-Fi Shed Ladder. So let me flip the cameras around and see where this one lands tonight. So back to the Sci-Fi Shed Ladder and ranking tonight's Hugo Award-winning novel for '94, Kim Stanley Robinson's Green Mars. And I'm taking a look at the A side of the board at the moment because that's where Red Mars is currently sitting. And what a wonderful novel it was. But when I apply my full criteria that I've documented below, I'm finding it really difficult to see Green Mars sitting on the A side of the board. And the main reason for that is when we're taking a look at the concept, there's nothing truly new or unique in the concept we see in Green Mars that we hadn't already seen in Red Mars. So it lost a couple of percentage points in the concept and also the execution. I thought Red Mars was a better executed novel on that idea, that terraforming, colonization of Mars, and some of that conflict that it had with the characters, that I thought it was just much better executed. And the characters themselves were so much better characters. The conflict between the characters I thought was very believable and just fantastic. And the other thing that is going to make it really difficult for Mars, Green Mars that is, to sit on the A side of the fence is that it was nowhere near as a memorable novel as what Red Mars was, at least for me. So I'm finding it really difficult to warrant Green Mars sitting on the A side of the board. So let me flip the board around and see what we've got to play with on the B side. So the B side is looking rather promising. We've got some wonderful novels on the B side as well. Maybe we'll start going through some of those because we've got classics like A Deepness in the Sky and Startide Rising. What wonderful concepts and brilliant space operas they were, right? The Uplift Wall. Foundation, and we got the Asimovs on here, The Gods Themselves and Foundation's Edge. And I think when you look at this novel, the Asimov factor is going to play a part again, because I can't justify ranking this novel above, a classic in Foundation's Edge and The Gods Themselves. And then we got some pretty unique concepts in The City and the City and that awesome novel Man Plus by Frederick Pohl, and again another wonderful concept in Babel 17. So when I look at the B side, it's a wonderful list. So maybe we need to take a look at the middle side of the board on the B side, because we've got novels, again, really memorable and exciting novels in A Memory Called Empire and Ancillary Justice and Stand on Zanzibar, which we reviewed not so long ago now, which was again just a wonderful concept. But I think it's going to sit somewhere in the middle of the board here. So maybe we ought to hone in on Barrier and say, does Green Mars warrant its place below or above Barrier? Because Barrier was really that character-driven novel, wonderful storytelling in Lewis McMaster Bujold's novel. But I'm going to have to give it to Kim Stanley Robinson and say that Green Mars, even as a standalone novel, still does more for the science fiction reader than what we found in Barrier. I think the concept and the execution of that terraforming, turning this barren planet into a green world, is just really well done. And although it has some issues with it being a bit bloated and a bit repetitive at times, I've still got to say I feel that Green Mars, on its own right, still warrants a really good read for the people out there who are patient enough to get through it, because you'll be, I think, well rewarded. It's a wonderful series, the Red Mars, Green Mars and Blue Mars, and I hope that this review has not put you off these really big, thick books, because they are a bit of a commitment, but I'll say it's one that is definitely going to be rewarding. Have you read the trilogy? What are your thoughts? I'm looking forward to rereading Blue Mars and see where it finally lands on our board. But that's where we land tonight. I hope you've enjoyed that. I've been Peter. This has been the Sci-Fi Shed. I'd love to hear your opinions as always, and I'll see you next time in the shed.